Welcome to the Bird Podcast. I'm Shobha Narayan. Once you start bird watching, you eventually become interested in conservation. And in this episode, which I call a post-episodes trailer, I'm going to pull out 4 interesting conservation experiments from 4 different episodes of the past. The hope is that I can persuade you to go back and listen to the really wonderful content that is in these episodes. In the text below, or in the show notes section as they call it, I'm going to tell you the exact minute at which this conversation happened, so that you can go back and listen to at least 5 or 10 minutes of this episode, if not the whole one. So we are going to start with episode 50, in which I interviewed Professor Yossi Leshem of Israel. Professor Leshem has been involved with bird migration and bird watching, bird preservation, conservation for decades. So he talked about how in 1993, as a young PhD student, he approached the Israeli Defense Forces to persuade them to help him prevent aircraft and bird collision. The reason is that every year, 1 billion birds migrate through Israel over 2 migration periods. Each migration period, the spring migration, for example, has 500 million birds, and the fall migration has 500 million. This is in a country that is about the size of New Jersey, or any state in India. So Professor Leshem in 1993 was shocked to find out that over time in Israel, aircraft collisions, there were 75 events, as he calls it, of aircraft and bird collision, leading to the death of 3 fighter pilots and countless millions of dollars in damage. So he told them, let me help you. I'm an ornithologist. Let me help you prevent this aircraft collision with birds. It's a win-win for everybody. Because until then, the Israeli military forces, their attitude was, the birds have been here longer than we have. We have to conduct our training exercises, and there's nothing that we can do. So Professor Leshem mobilized 4 tactics. First is, Israel has a huge community of bird watchers, and he asked them to, from the ground, to count the number of birds that migrate over Israel every year. The type of birds that he was concerned about were not the songbirds or the passerines that generally migrate during the cool periods at night, but the larger birds like raptors, pelicans, storks. They need the thermals, and therefore they have to go over land, not over the water, not on the Mediterranean Sea, which is a passerine migration. But if you want to use thermals for your migration, you fly during the day and over land. And this is ripe for bird and aircraft collisions. So he did 4 things, like I said: mobilize citizens, bird watchers, to count the birds. And then he tried flying. The Israeli Defense Force offered him a Cessna to fly with the birds to count them, but he found the noise was too disruptive for the birds. So he ended up using a motorized glider. And he says he flew right from when the birds entered Israel via Egypt till they took off via Lebanon. And for about 252 days, for 7 to 8 hours a day, he said it was thrilling to fly with the birds. He would go up on the motorized glider, cut off the engine, and basically soar with the birds, and he would count them. The third method was something that many other countries used. They used radar to see where the flocks of birds were present. But the problem with radar is that it will tell you the flocks, but it won't tell you what the birds are. And the fourth one is drones. And like Professor Leshem said, it was the first time drones were used for peacekeeping rather than for military purposes. But essentially, with the motorized glider, citizen scientists, the drone and radar, he was able to say exactly when the birds traveled, what was their patterns of flying, at what height they flew, what times of day they flew. So he had a rich data set. And he presented the data set to the colonel in charge of risk for the Israeli aircraft services. And he said, these are the patterns that we have. So do not fly your fighter training sessions at this time of the day, at this height, in this location. And he said, he monitored this for 5 years, between 1993 and 1998. And since then, until now, not a single death has happened and then the collisions fell, what he said, 76%, and the Israeli Defense Force saved $1.5 billion. Now, that's a significant amount. The other thing that Professor Leshem advocated was the use of border collie dogs in the Israeli aircraft fields to chase and shoo away the birds that were sitting in the aircraft fields, because a lot of the collisions happen as the aircraft is taking off. Or maybe you have seen the film Sully, where he took off the aircraft and a flock of Canadian geese, which weigh about 6 kgs each, they came at the aircraft, they destroyed 2 engines, and then Sully was able to land on the Hudson River and save the 150 passengers that were on board. So you see, it's these large birds, the geese, the raptors, the storks, and the pelicans that are the ones that need to be saved, both from themselves and for human safety. So this episode underscores one thing that every conservationist knows, is that in order to save wildlife, you need to factor in human safety as well. The second interesting conservation experiment is from episode 14, where I interviewed Chris Wood, who is the head of eBird, that wonderful app that we all use, and Ashwin Vishwanathan. But the organization that Chris talked about 45 minutes into that interview, and you should listen to that whole interview because both Chris and Ashwin make excellent points. But around 45 minutes, Chris talks about how the Nature Conservancy, which has this ingenious technique of basically buying up huge tracts of land and returning it to nature to rewild it. But instead of buying, they thought, why not rent the land? And the reason is that shorebirds migrating down south often fly over the Central Valley of California, which is also where about 8% of agriculture output of the United States comes from. So that's a significant number. And there's no way the Nature Conservancy could have afforded to buy up all that land. So instead, they approached the rice farmers of the Central Valley with a proposal saying that it was a reverse auction method where the farmers would bid for their lands to be rented by the Nature Conservancy during the migration period. So the rice farmers were flooding their fields anyway because it was a way for regenerative agriculture. So the Nature Conservancy's proposal was, you're flooding the field anyway, please do it for a few weeks before in the fall and a few weeks later in the spring, because through eBird and through NASA's radar data, they were able to pinpoint exactly where the shorebirds congregated for their refueling stops when they went down south. So then you have the whimbrels, the curlews, the dunlins. Each of these birds had their favorite spots. And of course, the birds have this coded genetic data. They've been doing it before humans walked the earth. So they had these set stops. And in fact, the Central Valley of California used to be, millennia ago, used to be all wetlands. Now it has become working farms. So the farmers had to just flood their fields for just 5 to 10 centimeters. And what happened was, it attracted the shorebirds, it gave them a resting and refueling stop. About 165 farmers, so the number keeps growing, and 165 farmers at one count were participating in this bird returns program, as it is called. They call it renting a habitat, they call it a pop-up wetland. But don't you think it's interesting that wetlands, and this specifically applies for highly populated countries like India, which are on flyway zones, or China, it helps the farmer because you're essentially paying him for keeping his field fallow and welcoming the shorebirds for a few weeks. And then the birds are being helped because their shorebird numbers were precipitously dropping, but then now they are slowly coming back. So that is an economic way in which conservation happened. The third idea is just one episode before, episode 13, where I interviewed author Cy Montgomery. It is a political method of conservation. In this episode, she talks about the majestic California condors, who were almost extinct. In fact, I think the date she says is in 1987. The last wild California condor was captured and reared in captivity so that the young could be released back into the wild. And Sai says at that time there was a lot of discussion about whether this was the right approach to do, but they did it, and now the condors are back for a variety of reasons, including one. That they discovered that the condors were dying because of two very strong reasons. One is that hunters were using lead bullets. Now, hunting is legal in America, and the lead bullets, which killed the other animals, antelope, deer, and so on, what happened was the condors are like the vultures, they feed on carcasses, they take the leftover carcasses to feed their young. And the lead bullets leave a trail of poisoned lead. So when you feed when the condors feed their young, it goes into the digestive tracts and kills the babies. Now, Sai says condor parents are the best parents. And they do another interesting thing. They bring their young little toys. Now, if it was from nature, they would bring flowers, they would bring twigs, they would bring little pieces of stone, things, interesting looking objects. But because California has a great hiking population, people would toss stuff on the trails. And so what Sai called micro litter, it was also killing the babies, because the condors would pick up interesting looking glass, plastic bottle caps, things like that. And so when you feed that to the young, it goes into the digestive tract. The glass birds, like these gizzards, have very strong digestive tracts where essentially the stone is being crunched into a sort of dust. Do that with glass and then you die. So two things had to happen. One was the citizens had to mobilize to go present to the California government about how these magnificent California condors were dying because of lead bullets, and could the hunters please use copper bullets. So that was legislated, and that made the condor numbers come up because lead bullets were banned. And isn't that wonderful? The second one was she organized citizens to pick up the micro litter. This was an educative exercise, and then people picked up the litter from the trail so that the condor parents wouldn't feed their plastic and glass and junk to their babies. So with Chris, the episode 14, you had an economic model of conservation. In episode 13, you had a political model of conservation. And the last episode I want to highlight is episode 29, which is a very visually amazing, pleasing episode, because it is about the magnificent flight of the Amur falcons that arrive in millions into Nagaland on their way down to South Africa. So in that episode, there are many interviews with forest officers in the field about how education and community involvement basically changed the contours of conservation, so that the Nagas, who traditionally are a hunter community and used to hunt and eat these Amur falcons, now treated them as honored guests and honored visitors into their homeland, and then saw them off on their migratory path. So these are the 4 episodes, and like I said, I will tell you exactly where to go to listen or watch it. I hope you go and listen to the entirety of these episodes with their very interesting conservation efforts. Bird Podcast is produced by Ullas Anand and Echo Edu. I am Shobha Narayan. Thank you for watching and listening.